Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ian Kavat. Antony Blinken's 10-day Asia trip has been aimed at redirecting attention to the US's greatest strategic challenger, China. The goal was to demonstrate that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are all in on the Indo-Pacific, ASEAN as an institution, and US partnerships across the region. The tour covered 8 countries, as well as the East Asia Summit, Quad, a 2+2 summit of defense and foreign ministers with Japan, followed by another 2+2 with the Philippines. Blinken's defense counterpart, Lloyd Austin, also formalized the US's security trilateral with Japan and South Korea. We ask whether countries in the region will benefit, how China is responding, and what it means for the prospects of peace and stability in the world's fastest growing region. Joining us to discuss this are Yeh-chung, National Chengchi University College of International Affairs Vice Dean, and Chia-yi, National Chengchi University Department of Diplomacy Professor. A very warm welcome to both of you on the show today. Let's start in the Philippines. The US announced a financial aid package to Manila described as unprecedented.
We're now allocating an additional $500 million in foreign military financing to the Philippines to boost security collaboration with our oldest treaty ally in this region. New steps to strengthen the alliance, once-in-a-generation investment to help modernize the Filipino Armed Forces and Coast Guard, our first bilateral security sector assistance roadmap, doubling our investments in the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement.
Professor Lee, let me start with you. So after the escalation that we've seen, mounting escalation between the Philippines and China, how important was this show of commitment from Washington to Manila?
I think this is indeed a big deal because the United States and the Philippines actually have a mutual defense treaty, which was signed in 1951. So the Philippines is actually the longest or the oldest ally of the United States. But we know the treaty has never been invoked before because this region is relatively stable and peaceful in the past few decades. But in the recent months, we have seen some escalation tensions in the South China Sea between China and the Philippines. So I think the United States is quite worried about the potential conflicts in this region. Also, the Philippines is important. It's a middle power in Asia. So I think the United States shows this commitment, use this financing in order to strengthen the Philippine military in response to the increasing tensions in this area.
That's right, and I understand it's to the military, but also to the Coast Guard.
Right, to the Coast Guard, because the treaty actually applies to the Coast Guard. If the Coast Guard is attacked by a third party, and we know the potential enemy is probably from China, so if it's attacked by Chinese Coast Guard, then actually the United States has the obligation to intervene. So I think that's why the US government is quite worried about this.
Okay. Professor Liu, earlier the Quad nations released a statement. That's the US, Japan, India and Australia. In the statement, they addressed the South China Sea. They said they had serious concern, strong opposition to unilateral actions to change the status quo by force or coercion. They talked about the militarization of disputed features. Now, they didn't mention China, but they called it that behavior coercive, intimidating and dangerous. And then China has hit back and they have said that the Quad is artificially creating tensions. What do you make of that response?
If China is opposing Blinken's view, statement, trip at all, then this can somehow antagonize ASEAN as a whole. So China right now is taking that, to see that as a fact that the United States is actually trying to adopt an encirclement strategy against China. China has been saying that, accusing United States for doing this for a long period of time. But this time, I think it is quite noteworthy that there seems to be a consensus among the Quad countries, between the United States and some ASEAN countries, that China seems to be the interrupter or disruptor to the regional order and stability. And also, China this time is trying to emphasize U.S. as an outsider, as an external force to this region, and also trying to say that the United States is not legitimate to have this kind of small grouping in this region.
Okay, and Professor Lee, would you agree with that China is finding it harder and harder to, separate, as we said, coming out of the Shangri-La dialogue, its words from its actions, completely divorce its words from reality?
I think China is facing more difficulties to frame itself as like a responsible superpower in the world, because China, what I have heard is that, especially I have some interaction with like professors from China, and they always say China has no intention to compete with the United States. They don't have any interest in becoming a superpower, so they just want to maintain its own interest. But the problem is that I think the world is changing, and other countries do not see China this way. So for the Chinese government, it's very hard to persuade other countries that it's a peaceful, rising superpower. So I think that's the difficulty the Chinese government is facing now.
Right. Now, in Tokyo, U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin described it as the most significant change to the Japan-U.S. alliance since it was created. He announced an upgrade to the military structure for American forces in Japan under a 3-star general, which will coordinate with a new Japanese nerve center to which will command Japanese forces. The 3-star general will create a commanding authority in Japan for the first time, without the need to wait for directions 3,500 miles away from U.S. Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii. Professor Liu, Tokyo actually had wanted a 4-star general. So an arrangement that was more akin to what they have in South Korea. Why do you think the U.S. didn't go that far?
Yeah, I think for now, the United States is trying to make to take some preventive measures against China. That's for sure. However, the United States is still trying to strike a balance between maintaining enough force to deter China, and if we are taking any step further, would China see that as a provocation? So how to balance these two ideas, I think that is the key. Austin said that if we are making this kind of arrangement, this will be a new groundbreaking settings for U.S.-Japan alliance. How so? Because the United States, along with Japanese counterparts, they are going to increase and enhance their coordination in the near future. So for example, right now there are 50,000 U.S. troops stationed in Japan. However, they are listening to the Indo-PACOM directly. On the one hand, as we can see, China may have some objections to this, that's for sure. But China cannot overinterpret that as a provocation to the Chinese, to the Chinese side. And also, for the U.S. side, as we can see, the United States believe this arrangement can make extended deterrence work better. Yeah, I think that's very, very important to the United States and to Japan.
Okay. Professor Lee, so we talked a little bit there about the difference that the overhaul could mean. Let's go into a little bit more detail when it comes to, for example, a Taiwan contingency. What would such a 3-star commander, who my understanding is only commands the US troops, but obviously works very closely, as Professor said, with the Japanese troops, what difference, practical difference does this make?
I think it actually makes a big difference because, as Professor Lu mentioned, Japan is actually home to more than 50,000 US troops. So it's a very important US foreign military base. However, the commander based in Japan doesn't have the authority to command. So if anything happens, the instructions have to come from the Indo-Pacific Command from Hawaii, which is so far away from this region. And in terms of the time difference, it's 19 hours behind the region. So if anything happens, say a war between China or any other countries in this region occurs, or a war across the Taiwan Strait occurs, then there will be no flexibility. There will be some delay in terms of the military operations. So if this, I think after this change, the practical improvement will be that these two militaries, the US military and the Japanese self-defense forces, can act more flexibility. They can have more flexibility. They can act more quickly if a war occurs. I think that will make a big difference.
So the idea of having a commanding center, Professor Liu, not in Hawaii, but much closer in Japan, which is essentially the first island chain. This is where we expect trouble could happen.
Yes.
During the US-Japan 2+2 meeting, and you mentioned it, that they recommitted to extended deterrence, which is both conventional as well as nuclear forces, if necessary, to deter enemy attacks. Now, the statement described a deteriorating security environment, not just from China, but also North Korea. But it did say that China has an accelerating and opaque expansion of its nuclear forces. So what kind of deterrence do you think the statement in itself had on China?
I think this is quite important because how to make extended deterrence work, actually we need to pay attention not only to the collaboration on the military side, but what is more important is how to send the political signal to your target effectively. That is the other side of the same coin to extended deterrence.
And the communication side.
Yes, yes, that is very, very important. And I think, as we just discussed, this time the United States and Japan agreed to somehow reshape their leadership in the near future. This is quite important. And I think this actually sent a very strong signal to China. Because this is not only trying to streamlining the chain of command between the United States and Japan, but also this reflects Japan is actually leaving pacifism behind after the Second World War. As we can see, the Kishida...
Is it completely though? I mean, the Japanese would probably argue not.
Yeah, definitely. But if we are making a comparison between now and 1970s, that's a big difference because back in 1970s, in terms of the national defense budget, it is only about no more than 1% of the GDP. However, back into Kishida government right now, the Kishida government has already passed the 1% cap and actually aims to reach the 2% cap of GDP in the years to come. So as we can see, Japan seems to be more I would say more aware about the threat they are facing, especially maybe not only from China, but also from North Korea. But China definitely would have to get this signal right.
Okay.
And
but it would be self-defense. I think that is.
Yes, that is the nature of this kind of arrangement. But to China, because I think China may have a different take on the regional order as opposed to others. For example, China, I wouldn't use the term backyard, but actually China would see the Indo-Pacific region. Xi Jinping once said, the Pacific is big enough to accommodate both the United States and China. So in other words, China is actually seeing this part of the world is quite important to China's national security. So China would take this kind of signals very seriously.
Professor Li, if we talk about China's side of things, of course, they are saying, as we've mentioned, that it's the US that's destabilizing, and so what's the sum of all of this? Is it that it raises tensions, or as we spoke about, that it has been a very careful step, boosting of deterrence, but very careful not to provoke? Which one is it?
I think that the US government is quite careful in terms of increasing its allies' self-defense in this region, including the Philippines and Japan. But it will be very, the US has to act very cautiously in order not to make a provocative action so that China will think this will be a provocation.
Does the idea from the US of what would be provoking and the idea from China, is it the same?
I think it may be a bit different. But my personal view is that, of course, China will be angered by this action. But from the current situation or the Chinese perspective, it's still the only thing China can do is probably to criticize this action and to scope this the cooperation between the US and its Asian allies. But the Chinese government is probably not capable of doing anything realistic that in order to counter the U.S. power.
Also, let me add to what Professor Lee just mentioned. China actually has a very different take on the concept of deterrence and on the concept of coercion. So when we are talking about issues regarding to international security, usually we are trying to set the status quo as the bar. And when we are talking about deterrence, we are trying to say that we are trying to save the status quo. But when we are talking about coercion, we are talking about changing the status quo. But for China, China seems to mix these two ideas up frequently. So to them, anything that the United States decide to do or to say can be seen as very provocative to the Chinese. So for example, when we are talking about the 2+2 meetings between the United States and Japan and the statement afterwards, China actually on July 30th, their Ministry of Foreign Affairs recalled the Japanese chief minister stationed in Beijing and make a formal protest against this kind of description in the statement. So as we can see, everybody is trying to maintain the status quo in the region, but Beijing seems to take it as a provocation against Beijing.
I mean, talking about the status quo, analysts have said for a while now that what China wants to do is to bring the status quo back from essentially the 1800s, right?
Yeah. So in the near future, what would China do? I would say maybe not too much, but we can expect that China would continue to trying to exert its muscles in diplomacy and also in military.
Professor Lee, in the statement between US and Japan following their 2+2 meeting in Tokyo, they did name Taiwan. They said that the maintenance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait is an indispensable element of security and prosperity in the international community. These are messages that we hear quite often now. The NHK says Japan and the US are very worried that Beijing could be emboldened enough to try to invade Taiwan. How much did you think, from what we've gathered from the trip so far, how much of it is actually about Taiwan?
I think during the meeting between Blinken and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, actually they mentioned Taiwan. I think Blinken accused China of being aggressive in the Taiwan Strait. But of course, Wang Yi will say this is the domestic issue of China. So I think Taiwan issue is still a very important part during this trip. And also I think in the 2+2 meetings between the United States and Japan, they also mentioned that maintaining the stability across the Taiwan Strait is very important.
But how about the agreements? How about the bolstering of capabilities? How much of that was targeted at Taiwan? I mean, there's a refocusing attention on the southwest islands of Japan.
I feel this trip is more about to reassure allies, especially Japan and the Philippines. Taiwan is probably, I think Taiwan is mentioned, but the Taiwan issue is probably not a focus in this trip.
Right, but then was also the doubling of the budget for the EDCA sites. That's the sites that the US has access to in the Philippines. You know, the new sites are very close to, or facing or very close to Taiwan. How about you, Professor Liu? How much do you think, you know, these initiatives were actually about Taiwan?
Yeah, I think without naming the Taiwan issue, I think both sides, the United States and Japan, are quite worried about the contingencies that can happen to the Taiwan Strait. And because on the Chinese side, no one can escape the tyranny of a calendar. Xi Jinping is actually facing the end of his third term in 2027. So even though people are making some very bold guess that maybe before that date, he would try to invade Taiwan to win over his fourth term. But I think it hasn't happened yet. So we still need to wait to see. However, as a trained scholar in international security, I think we need to prepare for the worst and hope for the best. So even though China there seems to be no indication that China is going to do this soon, But I think for everyone in this region, we need to get prepared. Yeah, so I think this is quite important.
Professor Lee, of course, there's the US election coming up in November. So for some commentators, they looked at this trip by Antony Blinken, farewell trip, but it was a way of shoring up support perhaps for the Democrats to have some election gain. He visited Vietnam, Laos, Japan, the Philippines, Singapore, and Mongolia. Why do you think that it was important to have this trip now?
I think, actually, I don't think this trip has too much to do with the election, because Biden, because the trip was actually scheduled way before Biden withdrew from the presidential race. But I do believe that the goal is to reassure the U.S. allies in this region. So it's an important part of the foreign policy under the Biden administration.
Do you think it was about, securing those arrangements so that they cannot be undone, Professor Liu, by a possible Trump presidency?
Yes, I think I agree with Professor Lee's comments about reassurance. If we are making a comparison between the Democrats' foreign policy vis-a-vis the Republican foreign policy into this region, I think we can see that there seems to be a big difference between the two different political parties in the United States. The Democrats now are trying to keep the momentum going because the Asia-Pacific and Indo-Pacific region seems to be a focus to the Democrats. I'm not suggesting that the Republicans, they don't care about this region. I'm suggesting that especially if we pay attention to U.S. foreign policy after the end of the Cold War, it is more often than not, the Democrats' administrations put more emphasis on this region. Of course, China seems to be the key player in the Democrats' thinking about the Indo-Pacific region. So under the Clinton administration, we can see that they are trying to engage China, trying to encourage China to become a responsible player in the international stage. However, this kind of taking began to change under the Obama administration. So on top of that, if we take a look at Biden administration's policy toward this region, we can easily find that it was Biden's initiative to elevate Quad to have summit meeting in 2021. So I would say the summit meeting of the Quad seems to be Biden's baby. So slash Blinken's baby. So I think this is quite important for Blinken to further secure and make sure that this kind of arrangement cannot be undone by the Trump administration again.
Okay. That being said, Professor Lee, so, here we are, we're in Taiwan. Tell me how much concern there is then about a possible Trump presidency in this region.
I think Taiwanese are quite concerned about the chance of Trump being elected again as the U.S. president, because we know that he used to be a businessman, and he changed, actually his mindset or his policies changed a lot. And when he was the president before, actually he took more like unilateral action. He doesn't really care about other countries. He doesn't care about allies. He mentioned that, so the allies of the alliance with Japan and South Korea are actually a burden for the United States. So actually they need to pay, right? He also mentioned that Taiwan should pay some protection fee to the US government. So I think there is indeed some concern in Taiwan that if Trump becomes the president again, Taiwan may be abandoned, or at least Taiwan may become less protected, or Taiwan may become less important for the US government.
Okay. Yeah. So it's not that Taiwan doesn't want to pay more on self-defense. It's actually the fear, Professor Liu, of being abandoned.
I think because according to the past experiences Taiwan has had with the Trump administration, everything seems to be possible. I think this kind of unpredictability that would worry allies a lot around the world. So I would say, from my personal opinion, Taiwan would be willing to shoulder more obligation and responsibility for our own national security, that's for sure. But usually when it comes to international relations or foreign affairs, to what extent Taiwan need to pay more for ourselves? By paying, I'm not just saying about the money. I was saying about how devoted we need to be for our national security. I think that is the key. So maybe Taiwan, in our own society, we need more elaboration and discussion.
Okay. More preparation in case of the worst scenario. Okay. Thank you so much. We have to end it there. Professor Yeh-chung and Chia-yi for joining Taiwan Talks today. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching the show today. Stay safe and see you next time.
We bring you stories from Taiwan every day of the week.
Our reporters travel the nation.
Exploring the issues that matter to you.
News from here in Taiwan and around the world.
What's Up Taiwan on Taiwan Plus.
At Connected, we believe in the power of dialogue. It's not just about the headlines, it's about finding common ground. Join the conversation.
Connected with Divya Gopalan on Taiwan Plus.